Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about deploying read-only domain controllers. In this video, we will take a look at the specific benefits of using an RODC or read-only domain controller. And what we'll see is that these benefits are primarily geared towards your smaller branch offices. Now, after we take a look at those benefits, we're going to go right into it and install an RODC in a branch office, configure what's called a password replication policy, and take a look at administrative role separation. And these are all things that will become clear after we see when and how an RODC is used. So, what are these benefits? Well, RODCs provide 3 security benefits that satisfy the needs of most smaller branch offices. See, out in our branch offices, we have security issues. Typically, we don't have corporate IT staff out there, and we may not have the actual physical security of our servers the way we do in our corporate offices. So, first of all, by default, RODCs do not maintain password properties on the user accounts. And what this means is, if somebody were to gain access to this domain controller, well, they would not be able to get access to any of the user passwords in the Active Directory database. Now, we're going to take a look when we get into it as to how we can change that and possibly keep some passwords out there, but we'll address that when we get there. The second benefit is that no changes can be made to the Active Directory database on the RODC. Now, this should be fairly obvious just by its name. I mean, the name is read-only domain controller. It means just that. You can access it and you can read from it, but you can't make changes to it. So again, if somebody were to gain access to the Active Directory database out on this read-only domain controller, they couldn't make any changes that would then propagate out to the rest of the domain controllers on our network. So that way it keeps things isolated out there in the branch office. And then lastly, we have that RODCs have a local administrators group. And here's the thing. A standard writable domain controller does not. There is no local administrators group on a standard domain controller. The local administrators are also the domain administrators. Well, because we may not have corporate IT out in the branch office, this local administrators group is key, because this way, whoever is at least helping us out and keeping an eye on the computers out in the branch office, whether it be an employee of the company who's maybe got a little bit of computer knowledge, so we give them a little bit of empowerment, or maybe we have a consultant that comes in. Well, now, whoever that individual or group of individuals may be, they will be able to go ahead and manage this particular computer, this computer that is acting as a read-only domain controller, without having access to Active Directory itself. So as a for instance, if the read-only domain controller is also a file server, well, they would be able to go ahead and manage the file server aspect of things without having Active Directory privileges. Alright, well, as I said, let's just get right into it. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install a read-only domain controller. We're then going to configure a password replication policy, which is going to allow some passwords to be stored locally. And I'll explain why that is when we're in there. And then we're going to take a look at that administrative role separation, which is what really gives a local administrator the ability to manage the individual machine. Now, to help understand exactly what it is that we're doing, I have on the screen now a picture of the Global Mantix network. And as you can see, out here in the Dallas office, this is a small branch office, which is off of the Chicago office. It's part of the na.globalmantix.com domain. So we probably want to have a domain controller out in Dallas because we don't want to have to always be going across this slow WAN link here to get back to Chicago. But you'll also notice that in this Dallas office, there's just the one server. And because there's just one server, well, that one server is going to probably have to serve many different roles, which is why we want to have the ability to give a local administrator some level of privileges over the server even though we have no corporate IT out in Dallas and don't want them messing with the Active Directory infrastructure. So, what we're going to do is, you may remember from a couple videos ago that we went ahead and through an automated installation created a computer with the name Dallas DC1. Well, I'm going to go ahead and connect to Dallas DC1 because even though we gave it that name, it's not actually a domain controller yet. We're going to connect to that server now and then turn it into a read-only domain controller. Okay, so the machine I'm on right now is the computer that we named Dallas DC1, and I'm going to go ahead and press Control-Alt-Delete and log in. You'll notice here that not only did we make it Dallas DC1, but we made it a member of the Global Mantix domain. Don't worry about that. If you're thinking, wait a minute, I thought we were making this a domain controller of the North America.Global Mantix domain, that's fine. We can be a member of the Global Mantix forest root and then go straight to becoming a domain controller for North America. So let me go ahead and log in here. And it'll take just a second here. There we go. And we have our desktop. And so what we want to do is pretty much the same thing that we've done before when installing the original domain controller back in the first video. I'm going to go ahead and click Start and go to Server Manager. And then in the Server Manager, I'm going to click on Roles. And then over here, I'll give it a moment here. There we go, just to realize we have no roles installed. I'm going to click on Add Roles. And then, of course, the role that we want to do is the Active Directory Domain Services role. Click Next. It gives us an intro into what that is. Next. And Install. Now again, this first part of the process is going to be basically the same as what we've seen before. The one difference will be that we're going to check a box representing this to be a read-only domain controller. But once we have it installed, everything from there should be just a little bit different. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this bar goes across the screen and we wait for the domain services role to be installed, and then I'll be right back with you when it's complete. Okay, as you can see here, the installation succeeded, and now we have our link here to close this wizard and launch the Active Directory DC Promo executable. So click that now. And I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Next. It's going to be an existing forest that we're installing in, and it's going to be a domain controller for an existing domain, right? Because we're just adding another domain controller for the na.globalmantix.com domain. So I'll click Next. And it says, now type the name of any domain in the forest where you plan to install this domain controller. So I'm going to leave the forest root name in there. That's just fine. That's not the domain that I'm necessarily joining right now. That's just one domain. So let me click Next. And now it says select the domain on which you were going to add the domain controller. So I'm going to expand this, and we're going to pick the na.globalmantix.com domain. Click Next. Here it wants me to select a site, and I know this is something we haven't gotten into. Basically, this is something we haven't set up yet, and this is used to control replication from office to office. So it is something that should be set up in the long run, but for right now, we're going to just leave the default site there and click Next. That's the only site we have, so there's not a whole lot of choice. And it's this screen that we're now going to do something different. Now you'll notice where this box has been grayed out every time we've looked at it before. I can now check the box to be a read-only domain controller. And the reason why is because we already have a domain controller for this domain, which means this is a possible option. Now let's talk about the other two options here. Do we want to be a DNS server and a global catalog server? Well, here's what we need to consider. Number one, DNS server. Do we want the users in this particular location, the users who are accessing this domain controller, to have to go somewhere else to be able to resolve DNS? And although the Dallas office may only have 10 users, the reality is we don't need them going across the slow WAN link over to Chicago to get to the next closest DNS server. So I'm thinking, yes, let's go ahead and make this computer a DNS server. And likewise, global catalog. Now, this is a term that may be a little bit unfamiliar to you unless you've studied Active Directory, but the global catalog server is what allows the user to log in and recognize universal group membership. And again, if this is not a global catalog server, well, then they're going to have to go across the slow WAN link to log in. So I'm thinking, yeah, let's go ahead and be a DNS server and a global catalog server, even though we're only a read-only domain controller. That way, everything can stay local in the Dallas office for the Dallas users. So let's go ahead and click Next. Now this screen, which is the delegation of RODC installation and administration, is not something that we have to worry about right now because we're actually going ahead and doing the complete installation. And this has to do with something called pre-staging of RODC installations. See, it says here that the user or group that you specify will be able to attach a server to the RODC account that you're creating now and complete the RODC installation. They also, of course, would then have administrative privileges on that RODC. We don't actually have to do this because we're not trying to pre-stage for an RODC. We're just installing it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next without worrying about this screen. Now, as usual, we need to pick a location for our stuff, and we only have one hard drive, so we'll take the defaults. Next. Need to go ahead and enter a password for restore mode. And go ahead and click Next. And here's our summary screen. Next. And there we go. We have begun the installation of this read-only domain controller. Now again, this will take a few moments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check this box saying reboot on completion. And I will pause the video and come right back with you as soon as we're done and rebooted and ready to go. Okay, so the process has completed. The computer has rebooted. So let's press Ctrl-Alt-Delete and log back in. And now, let's see if we can recognize anything that's different, that makes this a read-only domain controller. What I'm going to do is go ahead and click Start, and then go to Administrative Tools, and let's go to Active Directory, Users and Computers. Now, there's one thing I need to show you in this utility before we go into anything specific. And that is, let me go ahead and maximize this, and then I'm going to move this bar over to the right. And the reason I've done that is because I want to show you that even though I'm physically right now on the Dallas DC1 domain controller, this utility has connected to the Chicago DC1 domain controller. And the reason it did it is because we're logged on as a domain administrator. So since we're logged on with somebody who has privileges within the entire domain, this utility went ahead and assumed that we would want to go ahead and connect to a writable domain controller. Because remember, MMCs all have the ability to remotely manage other machines. So let's go ahead and right click right here on Active Directory Users and Computers and select Change Domain Controller. And now I'm going to go ahead and select the Dallas DC1 domain controller, click OK, and now you'll see that it says the selected domain controller is read-only. You'll not be able to perform any write operations. And that is what I wanted to see. So I'm going to click OK. And now if I expand the domain and right-click on a container, you may notice that there is something missing, and it would be right around here. I'd have a selection for new, giving me the ability to create something new. Well, I can't do that right now because this is read-only. Now I can still look at properties, I can still look at everything that has to do with this domain from this domain controller, but I can't make any changes. Now if I want to go ahead and make changes, well then I need to go back to Chicago DC1, which is the only writable domain controller within our domain. Now to demonstrate a couple more things to you, I'm going to do just that. I'm going to right click on Active Directory Users and Computers, change domain controller, and let's go back to Chicago DC1. And this time when I expand the domain and right click on Users, see there's that new we were looking for, and I'm going to go ahead and select New Group, and I'm going to create a group called Dallas Users. And this group is going to be a group that all users out in the Dallas office, all 10 of them, will become a member of. Now, global security group is just fine. Don't worry about that for right now. That's in a different lesson, but for right now, I just want you to go ahead and create this group if you're following along so that you can see a couple of the extra features of a read-only domain controller. So let me click OK. And before I go any further, I'm going to also create a user. I'm going to right-click, select New, User, and this user's name is going to be Dallas Administrator. And this is going to be for the user account that is going to administrate this specific computer. Okay, not necessarily the domain, but the individual computer. So I'm going to put Dal Admin for a username. Click Next. And put in the secret password. And again, don't worry about exactly why, but I'm going to clear the checkbox for having to change password at next logon, and I'll actually make it that the password never expires, just so that we're not hassled with it in this particular environment. Now, typically in a production environment, can be dangerous to never expire a password, but let's not worry about that for right now. Right now, I want to show you how read-only domain controllers work. So I'm going to click Next and Finish. Now I have created a couple of additional objects within Active Directory, the Dallas Administrator user account and the Dallas Users security group. Now let me quickly go back over here to the Dallas DC1 domain controller. Click OK and OK. And go ahead and click on the users container, and I'd like to show you that the Dallas Administrator and the Dallas Users group are also over there. Okay, so we do have replication working. Things that I create in Chicago do replicate out to Dallas. Let me go ahead and connect back to Chicago again, because we need to make another change. Okay, now the first thing I would like to show you has to do with something called password caching. I told you a little while ago that by default, no password-specific properties are stored on the read-only domain controller, and that's for security purposes. But the downside to that is when users from the Dallas office connect, or attempt to log in, I should say, what the Dallas DC1 read-only domain controller has to do is it has to go across our WAN link over to Chicago DC1 to go ahead and verify the password. And that can create longer logon times and add additional traffic to our WAN link that maybe we don't feel needs to happen. So if we would like to have the passwords for the Dallas users stored on the Dallas DC1 domain controller, well, then there's a couple of ways we can do this. Let me go ahead and expand this so we can see all these names of all these different groups, because there's a group here called the Allowed RODC Password Replication Group. And basically anybody you make a member of this group, well, that means that passwords will be replicated and therefore cached out onto the read-only domain controller. So if I double click here and then go to members, you'll see here that there are no members. If I want for the Dallas users group or members of that group to have their passwords cached, then I would click Add. And if I put in Dallas, and actually I'll just click Check Names, and here's our Dallas users group, and click OK. Now the Dallas users group will all have their passwords cached. But there is a problem with this. And I'm going to actually, because there's a problem, I'm going to highlight this and click Remove. Yes, I want to remove and go ahead and get out of here. The problem is that by adding the Dallas users group to the Allowed RODC Password Replication Group, that means that those passwords will be cached on any and all read-only domain controllers in this domain. Now, as it turns out, this is the only read-only domain controller in the domain, and maybe it's the only one that we plan on having. Well, then it would be okay. But what if plans change in the future? What if we add another small branch office and we don't want the Dallas users being cached out there. Well, in that instance, what we would want to do is go ahead and set up password caching on the specific read-only domain controller. And we do that by going to the properties of the actual domain controller. So I'm going to click on the domain controllers container here. And here you will find the computer account for the Dallas DC1 read-only domain controller. So I'm going to right click and go to its properties. And then you will see there's a tab called Password Replication Policy. When I click on that tab, you will see the accounts that by default have the ability to have their passwords cached on this domain controller. And check it out. Everybody is set to deny except the allowed RODC password replication group. Okay, they're the only ones that are set to allow. What I could do if I had somebody specific that I wanted to add to this one domain controller is then I go ahead and click on Add. And then here I get to choose, is this going to be an allow ad or a deny ad? I'm going to click allow, click OK. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in the Dallas users. Let me click check name. There we go. The Dallas users group. Click OK. So now the Dallas users group, or any users who are a member of the Dallas users group, will be allowed to have their passwords cached locally on this individual domain controller, on the Dallas DC1 RODC domain controller. Click OK. And now we're all set up so that anybody who's a member of the Dallas users global group won't have to wait to have their passwords checked back on the Chicago DC1 domain controller. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you has to do with something called administrative role separation. Remember that one of the nice features about a read-only domain controller is that it does have local groups, whereas a typical domain controller, a full-blown writable domain controller, does not have local groups. But in order to get to those local groups, you have to do something a little bit different. Now let me go ahead and close out of Active Directory Users and Computers. And normally what you would do if you wanted to manage local users and groups, you'd click on Start and you would go ahead and just go to the Server Manager. I was gonna right click on Computer and go to Manage. Now let me show you. Takes you right into the Server Manager. That's kind of the old school in me. The old versions of Windows, you used to have to right click My Computer Manage in order to get to the right console. Now you just have Server Manager right on the Start menu. Anyway, once in the Server Manager, what you would do is expand configuration, and then in here you would have local users and groups. Well, although there are some local groups, this is a domain controller. And so you're not going to find that normal stuff here. So let me go ahead and close out of the Server Manager and show you how you would make somebody an administrator of this local computer. You have to do it from the command prompt. So I'm going to click Start and then go to the command prompt. Once in the command prompt, I'm going to type in dsmgmt and then go ahead and hit Enter. And it'll take you into the DS Management utility. Now, again, because it's a command prompt utility, you always have the ability to go ahead and hit question mark and get help. Okay, but what I want to do is I want to go ahead and you'll see right here, local roles is what I want to do. I want to make somebody a member of a local role. So local roles, and you'll see it changes into a local roles prompt. Again, if I were to hit question mark, you'll see here I can get some help on what it is that I want to do. And in this case, right up here where it says add, and then the syntax is like really hard to understand. Well, what they're trying to tell me to do here is add space, and then the first variable is the username. See, it says adds the account this variable. So I'm going to put in DAL admin, right? That's our Dallas administrator account that we created, to the local role, another variable. And the local role I want to add this particular user to is going to be the administrator's role. Okay, so I'm basically saying add Dallas admin to the administrator's role. Hit enter, and you'll see here it says successfully updated the local role. Now another option here is it says list roles. So I'm going to type in list roles, and you'll see that you can add somebody to pretty much all of the typical local built-in groups that you find on standalone or member servers. Okay, so if you want to have that separation of duties, if you want to go ahead and make somebody a member of a specific type of local group so as to be able to manage the individual server but without having Active Directory specific privileges, then this is how you do it. And this is called administrative role separation. And it's separation because it's separating from the local roles versus the Active Directory roles. That's pretty much it for what we need to see on this read-only domain controller. Well, not only is that everything we need to see on our read-only domain controller, but that's pretty much it for this video. So at this point, you should now know how to deploy an RODC. And as you saw, basically it's the same thing as deploying any other domain controller. It's just one checkbox that you check saying, hey, I want to be read-only. You should also now know how to configure a password replication policy. As you saw, it can either be done for the entire domain if there are certain accounts you want cached throughout the entire domain to all read-only domain controllers, or you can configure it on a specific RODC. And then you should also now know how to configure administrative role separation. In other words, make somebody a member of a local administrators group so that they can administrate the local machine separate from Active Directory. And again, remember, that can only be done through the command prompt. It cannot be done through the GUI. Alright, well, that's it. I will see you in the next video.